Hey Heike, hey everyone, thanks for joining. My name's Chris. I'm a senior product manager in our customer experience team within Microsoft Security Engineering. So I'm responsible for working with a lot of our customers to help them get the best value out of the products, to capture insights, to capture sort of feature requests, and make sure that we're building the products that customers are asking for. I own what we refer to in Microsoft as a POC as a service for identity threat detection and response. So this is something that our customers can ask their account teams for, and we can deliver. And the idea is that it's a 5-day engagement with some deep technical workshops. We provide customers with a lab environment that they can use to try out the different products and sort of give them a test drive, if you will. And what we've done is we've decided to condense some of the workshop material and deliver it in a set of public webinars, this being the first one. And we think it will be valuable to everyone to get some deeper knowledge and understanding of Microsoft's ITDR platform, where we're going with it, and what the different capabilities of it are. So with that, we've got 4 sessions lined up for ITDR in particular. We've got the session 1 today, which is the introduction to what ITDR is, what it means to Microsoft, and then we're going to touch on the prevention capabilities that are in the platform. Tomorrow is session number 2, and then we'll talk about detection, which I guess is the bread and butter of the ITDR platform, being the D in ITDR. Then session 3, which will be next week on Tuesday at the same time, we'll dig into investigation and hunting, and we'll talk a little bit about the identity hunting tables and how you can use those. And then session 4, the final session, will be next week on the 1st of May, and that will be a session all about response. And I'll also talk a little bit about some of the best practices for actually delivering a POC. So with that, let's get started on session number 1. So ITDR, what is ITDR and what does it, why have we got ITDR and what does it mean to Microsoft? So first and foremost, identities within an organization are your first line of defense. They are the new security perimeter. It only takes one user identity to get compromised through some sort of identity-based attack, whether that's phishing, whether that's an MFA fatigue attack, credential stuffing attack, or something similar, to have that identity compromised and then almost fall to the attacker, where the attacker can then use that identity to get much deeper and higher levels of access within your environment, and ultimately perpetrate some style of attack against your organization. So there's many examples of this in the press recently with some of the high profile breaches and compromises that you might have heard of. It only takes one identity to get compromised, and the whole organization can fall. And we do see this, things like human operated ransomware attacks. The amount of time going from identity compromise through to full tenant encryption is really quite low, and it's quite scary when you look at the numbers. So we have a saying, which is, attackers don't break in, they log in, right? They compromise identity and they use those identities in an illegitimate way to get access into your environment. So that sort of sets the scene a little bit about why this is important, right? Identity compromise is absolutely important, and we must take, all of the steps and actions that we can to protect our organizations against that. We're all familiar with EDR in an organization. We all know that we should protect endpoints through our endpoint detection and response. And what we need to do is start thinking about how we apply those same types of capabilities to our identity protection as well. So when we're talking about ITDR and what it means to Microsoft, we're talking about how we can empower our security operations teams to get visibility of those identity compromises, to get visibility of misconfigurations and issues that might lead to compromise, have the native built-in response actions that we can leverage to drive response and mitigation when an identity does become compromised. And then also on the identity team side, like how do we empower our IAM teams and bring those two things together? In a lot of customers and a lot of organizations, XDR or the security operations teams are maybe a little bit disjointed from the identity teams. They're generally different teams. They've got different goals, they've got different capabilities that they're driving. What we want to do in Microsoft is we want to bring those two teams together and we want to empower both of those teams to get full visibility of identity issues, identity compromises, and help both teams mitigate those particular compromises. So with the evolution of identity protection, really ITDR for Microsoft is the glue, as I would say, the glue that sits between the identity and access management side of the fence and the extended detection and response side of the fence, which is the security operations. So ITDR is that bit in the middle that wants to bring those two things together in ways that are meaningful to both of those teams. And there's some very concrete and specific examples of where that comes to fruition within our products. And I'll talk a little bit about those areas over the next sort of 4 sessions as we get a little bit deeper with the capabilities that we have. From a Microsoft point of view, we are, of course, a leader in identity management. Microsoft Entra is by far and away the biggest identity provider in the world. We are market leaders in identity and access management with Microsoft Entra, and we also have one of the most capable XDR platforms in the world as well, in Microsoft Defender XDR. So what we're doing is we're building those experiences, as I've described, to bring those two products together in a way that really empowers both your IAM teams and your SecOps teams built on that Microsoft platform. So when we're talking about ITDR, there's a set of capabilities that we should expect an ITDR platform to have. The way to think about this broadly is like EDR for your identities, as I've just mentioned. So what an EDR brings you in the case of deep visibility, native response actions, all of that is what we want to do for our identity fabric and our identities themselves. So there's a set of specific capabilities that I'm going to talk about now, which we believe should be part of an ITDR platform and built into those workflows that your teams are using today. So the first one is quite broadly posture. How can the identity threat detection tools identify misconfigurations and issues within your environment across both your identity infrastructure and the identities themselves? So surfacing up specific misconfigurations on the infrastructure might be something, to give an example of that, might be something like LDAP signing is not turned on your domain controllers or within your domain. That could lead to some sort of issues within your environment. Or on an identity itself, it could be that Kerberos pre-authentication is disabled, which could open you up to roasting style attacks within your environment. So we want to surface all of those misconfigurations up and give you the opportunity to be able to maybe be able to resolve those particular issues. The next thing then is detection of privileged accounts, service accounts, privileged escalation paths. Like how can we give you visibility of where identities, if compromised, could lead to further compromise and elevation of privilege within the environment? So we can analyze that in terms of specific accounts that if compromised could lead to maybe a domain admin being compromised through some sort of escalation path. We also want to give you context and visibility on things like privileged accounts and service accounts. That's very valuable information from a SecOps point of view. If you're investigating an incident and there's an asset in there which is an identity, and that identity is a domain administrator, then that's pretty important context to understand what the scope of that incident might be. A domain admin being compromised is something that you would probably want to roll some response on pretty quickly. Not to say that you wouldn't roll response on identity compromise for lower privileged users, but the scope of that and the importance of that might become more high profile for you. Having an idea of service accounts as well within the environment. We can do that in our ITDR solution today. We can identify group managed service accounts and managed accounts, and also accounts which have SPNs configured, which is useful context if you want to use that in maybe some custom detections that you want to write to identify where specific service accounts are logging into assets that they shouldn't be, right? So all of that is very important context for us. Having some sort of UEBA or behavior analysis across your identities is pretty important as well. Like, yes, we want to detect identity compromise, but we also want to identify where risky behaviors are happening that might not in and of themselves be high fidelity enough to create a specific detection. So with the UEBA capabilities, you want to identify where identities are doing things that are out of character for that particular user, and then with that we can highlight and surface up some of those risks into the security operations console, and you can use that then to maybe figure out if a user is potentially leading towards being compromised, or maybe there's interesting context there if you have got some alerts for that user, like what are the risky things that that user has done before and after that specific event that's been flagged. So again, this is all useful context for you in terms of investigating a particular incident. We also want to look at that user activity monitoring, inventorying, profile building as well. So what I mean by that is that's basically what an EDR does for your endpoints today, right? It's giving you that black box to be able to roll back in time to see what's happened on your device. You know, maybe in the case of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, the last 180 days, you can scroll back. We also want to do that from an identity context as well. So, you know, maybe I've got a detection that's fired on Chris, you know, within an environment. Like, what was I doing before that particular detection fired? You know, maybe there's some interesting artifacts on my login timeline in the previous 7 days, previous 14 days. What things was I logging into, and what was I logging into post that compromise as well? Because that might help me understand what the scope of that particular identity compromise is. So the ability to monitor that user activity and to store that in a way that we can query it and we can roll back in time and see everything that a user has been doing, both, by the way, on premises and in the cloud, is pretty important when we're talking about how we can investigate particular incidents. The inventorying and profile building is really how we leverage some of that IAM capability to bring in context within the console. So as an example, you know, if there's Chris again as a user, you know, maybe there's some interesting context from Entra about me as a user, the roles that the Entra roles that I'm a member of. Am I a global administrator? Am I a security admin? In Active Directory, am I a domain admin? Do I have a certain level of privileges there? We can surface all of that information up into a user page that when and we will show this in session 3 actually, but we can go into that user page and then I can see that context, and then I can use that context to make assertions about how I want to investigate that incident, what the scope of that incident is. So it's really important to sort of surface that up. Then talking about the detections of threats across identity specific threats, that's the sort of bread and butter, as I said, of the ITDR solution. Of course, we want to detect those things, right? We want to see where a pass the ticket attack is being used. We want to see where there are specific identity related threats across my users, but also specific identity related threats across my identity infrastructure as well. So we want to do that for both on-prem and the cloud. So it's a different type of threat in cloud identity than it is in on-prem identity. You know, on-prem identity, we're talking about Kerberos-based attacks, password-based attacks. We're talking about attacks against the domain infrastructure. And by the way, we've now extended our coverage to things like Active Directory certificate services, which is a pretty unique play for us right now. So we can give you visibility of attacks, specific attacks against the PKI in your environment. But also from a cloud identity perspective, it's a different type of attack. We're talking about password spray, credential stuffing. We're talking about anomalous atypical travel style detections. We're talking about attacks against MFA as well, like MFA fatigue attacks, which are, you know, up and coming and becoming more prevalent. And with Microsoft, we also want to extend that visibility outside of the Microsoft specific stack, right? We want to start encompassing third-party identity providers into our story as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then lastly, is the ability to respond. Now, all being well, we won't ever get to the position where you are compromised and you need to respond. Like, hopefully, with all of the detection of misconfigurations and the identification of privilege escalation paths and stuff beforehand, will give us the ability to fix issues before they become real problems in the environment and then actual identity compromise. But that being said, if an attacker does manage to break through those defenses and get to a point where they have compromised identities, you've identified that through some of the alerts and incident technology that we have, you want to be able to respond to that in a native built-in way that really shuts down an attack and mitigates that attack. So we have a set of manual response actions that we can trigger. And again, we'll talk about this in session 4 in a little bit more depth, but things like disabling the user account, forcing a password change, etc. Or attack disruption, which is part of our XDR platform, can do a lot of these things automatically for you as well. And again, we'll go into attack disruption a little bit in session 4 and how MDI, Microsoft Defender for Identity, and our ITDR solution really play into the attack disruption playbooks that we've configured. We also now are looking to extend more preventative style response actions to both cloud and on-premises through things like conditional access. So conditional access, you're probably all familiar with in Microsoft Entra ID. It's a way for us to be able to configure policy to enforce things like MFA or to be able to block access in particular circumstances. We can do that today in the cloud, of course. Right now, we can extend that to our on-premises environments through the Entra Private Access capability that we've just released into public preview. So we're really sort of trying to give you tools and capabilities for all of these different areas. So when we're talking about protecting your identity fabric, when we're talking about ITDR as a platform, what do we mean? Like, what are we talking about protecting? Well, essentially, we're talking about protecting everything that's identity related, right? In short, but to sort of call that out a little bit, any identity, we're talking about human identities, people that are logging in, logging out, whether they've got multiple accounts or not, we should be protecting all of those human accounts. Also, service or workload based accounts as well. An account might be, a service account might be configured in the environment, and that service account, if compromised, might have and often does have some high level of privilege. So how do we get visibility of that? How do we protect that as well? So any identity, essentially, and any identity component. So of course we support our first party services, Microsoft Entra ID. We've got built-in capabilities there. It's out of the box. It's all available for you, and that signal is brought directly into the XDR portal that we have, into Microsoft Defender XDR. And then we cover all of those on-premises services as well. So Active Directory is, Active Directory domain services being the core one, which is your domain controllers effectively. We support Active Directory federation services. So if you do run ADFS in your environment, then we have a sensor that you can deploy there that will give you visibility and context from those authentications that are happening through ADFS. Recently released, I say recently released, but probably 6 to 8 months ago now, we released our ADCS sensor. And again, this is something that we worked really hard on, we're really proud of, because it gives us some great visibility into certificate services based attacks. So some examples of that are like the ESC1, ESC8 vulnerabilities, probably the two most common ones that we see if you're familiar with those. We'll talk a little bit about those in the posture and in the detection session tomorrow as well. And we've just released into private or public preview, I'm not sure, the Entra Connect sensor also. So if you're on our CCP community, you can sign up to CCP, and there's some context around the Entra Connect sensor there as well. So we're trying to cover all of your identity components on-prem, but we also want to cover third parties as well. So we have today some limited capability for Okta and OneLogin. We're looking to expand that support. So we have some detections that we've built for those particular services, and we're looking to expand that capability into the future as well. So looking at other solutions where we can start to bring those in, and that applies to any vendor and anywhere to that context there. So we want to be the identity protection platform for all of your identity fabric. So what are the core pillars then of identity threat detection and response? So broadly speaking, we've got three specific pillars that we're looking to cover. The first one is prevention. We're going to cover a little bit of that today, as I mentioned. We've got detection, which we'll cover in the session tomorrow. So what types of identity threats are we going to pick up? What types of detections will we fire across the different sensors that we have? How does that apply to the identity compromise, to the identity fabric compromise? So we'll dig into that in much more depth tomorrow. And then response, which is the sort of final pillar, and I mentioned this already in terms of like attack disruption and manual response actions. In between that, we also have some type of a hunting capability also, which allows us to really investigate compromise. So that sort of falls under the detection pillar. There's a specific session we're going to cover on hunting and investigation, because I think it requires a little bit of focus in terms of some of the cool things that we can do with that, and it's something that I know the team are really proud of, and we'll dig into that on session 3. So just to talk a little bit about the architecture of our identity threat detection platform today, we have Microsoft Defender for Identity, which is our way that we protect the on-premises environment. So ADFS, ADCS, and domain controllers I've already mentioned. And the way that we get visibility of that, and the way that we surface that up, is through the sensor that we deploy onto these particular servers. So we collect, we parse network traffic predominantly. So on the domain controller in particular, we have a network packet filtering capability. And what we're doing is we're analyzing network traffic as network traffic comes into the domain controller, and then we are parsing that and firing those events up into the cloud service, where we then have our brain, so to speak, which is looking at profiling the activities that are happening, and then firing any alerts or interesting interesting artifacts around that telemetry. In addition to the parse network traffic, we also collect specific events and event tracing from the sensor as well. So we will collect specific Windows events where they're relevant. So that might be like logon events is a good example of that. And then we can correlate those events with the network traffic, and that gives us some higher fidelity, so to speak, on those particular those particular activities. And we do a similar thing on the ADCS sensor and the ADFS sensor today. We're collecting mainly those events and those event traces, and we take that visibility up into the cloud service, where it's processed, and then all of that processed data lands into the Microsoft XDR solution. We're also capturing visibility of Active Directory entities as well. So things like the user, the user's groups, the user's properties. These are all things that are surfaced up into the user profile page within the XDR portal as well. And of course, the Microsoft Defender XDR solution is bringing in signals from all of the other Defender products. So that's the email solution, the endpoint solution, the cloud application solution. We're bringing all of that signal into Microsoft Defender XDR, and then we're correlating all of that information together. And we'll talk a little bit about incidents in the investigation session as well. So just to sort of expand that a little bit more, of course we have signals coming in from Entra Identity Protection as well, but they're directly integrated into the Microsoft Defender XDR solution. And then we're also bringing in today, as I mentioned, some limited third-party data from some third-party identity providers via our Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps service, and then we can bring the activity data in to Microsoft Defender XDR, and then we have detections and profiling that we can look at across that particular telemetry also. So with that, then, just 2 quick points to sort of wrap up on what we're going to talk about in this prevention section for the next 30 minutes or so, is around some of the prevention capabilities that we have. So I mentioned the prevention pillar, and we're looking specifically to give you the tools and capabilities to help prevent compromise within the environment, and then also to be able to have some sort of policy control over what's happening in the environment as well. So we're going to talk a little bit now about posture and about exposure management, which is a new capability that we have. And then I'll touch very briefly on some of the adaptive access controls that we have today. But I think I'll pause there just for a second in case, Heike, there's any questions from the forum, and then we can go into the demo.
Wonderful. Thank you for remembering. Yes. So first of all, I would like to know, so how do we think about why do we see ITDR spanning identity access management and XDR in the benefits? So how do you see this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I mentioned at the sort of beginning that what we see in customers that we talk to is there's a little bit of a disconnect. Sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect between those 2 teams within an organization, and that can lead to gaps in coverage, right? And that those gaps can manifest in different ways. So an example of that might be that the identity and access management team will own like conditional access. They'll own policy around who can access what, because that generally fits with the identity and access management team. And then we have our security operations teams that are generally responding to incidents. So you can imagine scenarios that are quite interesting where, you know, if I'm responding to an incident and I want to like trigger some sort of policy control for blocking a user or maybe applying MFA or whatever the case might be, that those policies and those controls probably exist in the identity and access management solution today. So how can we have a workflow, let's say, between those 2 tools that sort of bridges that gap, where as a security admin or a security analyst, I can look at a compromise, I can then think, okay, this user does need to be blocked, or this user does need to have some sort of policy control applied. I can click mark the user as compromised, and then how can that surface up to then you know, trigger some sort of preventative control for that user accessing different applications in the environment. And we can sort of do that today through conditional access and the private access that I mentioned. The confirm user compromised response action we'll talk about. That's just like one scenario in terms of how we can feed from you know, a response action back into triggering sort of policy controls that the identity team have controlled. Vice versa, the identity team generally have lots of context about a user identity. You know, they manage the users within the environment, they provision the users. So things like the groups the user is a member of, the privileges that user has. That is pretty interesting context as well for the security admin, right? So if we can bring that context into the XDR portal, then we can start to look at things like if a user is part of an incident and they've got some detections on them, like are they a domain admin? Do they have some level of privilege that would be interesting for us to understand if we need to apply some, you know, tighter lens, let's say, on the response to that particular that particular compromise that might be happening. So there's a little bit of flow between the 2. And then on the prevention stuff that we're going to talk about now, we have visibility of identity misconfigurations in both portals. So we're sort of surfacing up the misconfigurations within the Defender portal, so the security admins and the security analysts can identify things that might lead to, you know, they've got a good understanding of, you know, what are the vulnerabilities that might lead to a compromise. You know, they generally are got the fingers on the pulse, so to speak, in terms of, you know, what the latest and greatest vulnerability is. We can surface some of that configuration and visibility up to the security admin, and then we can also surface it up to the identity and access management admin, because generally they're the ones that are going to fix it, right? So the security admins aren't necessarily going to fix you know, turning on LDAP sign-in. They're going to need to go to the identity and access management team and say, listen, you know, this is misconfigured. it can lead to this type of compromise, you might want to go and go and fix this, and maybe they can give them some guidance on that as well. So you want to have open communication between the two teams and try and surface it up where you can.
Yeah, we will have a look at that shortly when you go into the demo, but there's another question that I would like to ask you.
Sure.
So we have had Microsoft Defender for Identity in place for several years now, but we are looking to do a complete review of this. Would you recommend us putting the alerts back into learning mode? Is there a recommended period in which you should do this? An example, once every year.
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, we have a concept of learning within our detections, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow in a bit more depth in terms of what the learning is. That learning period is on by default, and the learning period is variable for different detections. It's not like a set learning period for all detections. Like each detection has might have a slightly different learning period that our security researchers have defined for various different reasons, and the learning period might be triggered based on different things as well. So it could be the first activity from that user, the first activity from the source device, the first time we see something at the domain controller. So those learning periods are there, they're on by default, and we have those to suppress, specifically to suppress false positives that might be triggered within the environment. Now, we do have a configuration option now where you can go into the advanced settings within Microsoft Defender for Identity, and you can switch those learning periods off, or let's say you can tweak the sensitivity of those particular detections. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the last session when we talk about POC best practices. We added that for customers that want to do things like penetration tests or red team exercises. They want to really see, they want to bypass those learning periods and fire those detections in a readily available way. You've now got the control to do that. Would you run your service in that mode permanently, or reset that on a yearly basis? You probably wouldn't reset it on a yearly basis. Would you run some of those detections in that mode permanently? Really depends on the organization, because if you go into, let's say, the brute force detection and move that slider to be, I can't remember which way it is now, but move it to be more sensitive effectively, then you're going to get more alerts, right? And the reason for that is because we're dynamically changing thresholds in terms of when we fire the detection. We're removing some of the learning periods. Now, that might be suitable for your organization because you're like, I absolutely want to know about all of the brute forces that are happening. It's like super important to me. But can you handle the alert volume would be the question that you need to ask yourself. So that slider is really there for advanced use cases where you feel things might be more important for you, or if you want to test the products and you want to make sure that you're getting the most effective detections based on some sort of red team or testing exercise. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that in more depth over the coming sessions as well.
Thank you very much. So for the person who asked the question, if we didn't answer the question, you can also please send a follow-up to that one. But now, before there's more questions, but I would like to go into the demo now.
Okay.
And keep a couple of questions for later. So
Perfect.
Let's go.
Okay, so I spoke a little bit about the prevention capabilities that we have, and we have something now in the product called exposure management. So this is something that's pretty new. It's been added to the product pretty recently, and it gives us quite a lot of decent visibility. Now, just before I'm going to dig into exposure management, we in this particular tenant we have the new unified security operations experience enabled. You can see just as a quick portal walkthrough, we have our alerts and our investigation and hunting within this investigation and response tab. We're going to dig into that tomorrow. We have this threat intelligence tab. We're not really going to talk about that in this 4-part session, but just be aware that it's there. We have our assets here. So we have our device inventory and our identities inventory. That's pretty important for us as well. We have, because this is the unified experience, the Microsoft Sentinel tab there. We have this identities dashboard. This is, again, fairly new. So this is populated from the MDI team. We can see here, it gives us visibility of all of our cloud users that we have, hybrid users, on-prem users. So we're sort of populating that. We can see our deployment health. So in this instance, we've got some sensors onboarded. We can see 2 out of 2 possible sensors are onboarded, and we have some health alerts that probably need to be addressed. So we can dig into what those health alerts are if we needed to. We can see that the licenses are available and the service is enabled. We can see our secure score, and again, we're going to dig into that in a second and what that means. We can see a subset of our privileged identities within the environment. I can click on to view all identities and go a little bit deeper there. We can see some identity related incidents within this environment, some domains that have some misconfigurations that we probably want to dig into, just some like interesting insights, let's say, for what you might want to look at as a sort of first stop on a daily basis. You can go into here, you can just get a view of what's going on. The health issues are logged into the health dashboard here. You can see that there's one health issue that's been raised there because we haven't got the right auditing turned on. And then we now have this tools section as well, where we've got things like our sizing tool, we've got the readiness script, we've got the PowerShell module. There's a couple of things available to us there to help onboard and help get the solution up and running. And then the other Microsoft Defender products will have tabs as well, so endpoints, email, cloud apps, etc. And then we have all of our settings for the solution for Microsoft Defender for Identity will be in the identities section here. So we were just talking very briefly about the alert threshold, just to call out where that is. It's in the adjust alert thresholds there, just for awareness. But all of the configuration of MDI is in here. Now, Microsoft Entra will by default pull in the detections that fires, or a subset of the detections by default into the identity portal. You don't need to configure that. The only option you have configuration wise would be, do you bring all of the detections, or do you bring the high profile detections, so to speak? So just on the exposure management here, this is our one-stop shop now, which is giving you visibility of all of the misconfigurations in the environment. It's giving you some initiatives, which I'm going to talk about, that you can drive to help resolve some of the challenges that you might see in an environment. So we'll start here with exposure insights. There's 2 broad capabilities: the attack surface and the exposure insights are the 2 main areas. So we're going to go into exposure insights here, and if we go into initiatives, you'll see that there's a number of initiatives which are predefined here, that are, the way to think about this is they're programs of work that we're helping you identify, which you can use to drive remediation within your environment. So if I scroll down here, you'll see we've actually got one specifically for identity security, and the data is coming from Microsoft Defender for endpoint, identity, and Microsoft Entra ID. Now, if I click that link there, you'll see there's a number of security recommendations that make up this initiative. So there's 39 total recommendations, and we have a number of metrics that we're identifying for you. So the metrics are we're analyzing those recommendations or those controls, and then we're figuring out which ones have the highest impact, which ones have are easiest to configure, and then we're surfacing them up into specific metric buckets that you can use to help drive remediation. So as an example, we have here, in fact, I'll just go to the initiative page so you can see and just make the screen real estate a bit bigger. You can see all of the metrics that we have. So there's 9 metrics that are listed for the identity security initiative. So you can see, MFA, bad on us for this demo tenant. It is only a demo tenant. MFA needs some attention, but everyone knows about MFA. So if I dig into, let's say, this one here, best practices to ensure identity infrastructure is configured securely. So that's something that's probably interesting for us. You can see that there's 10 controls that make up this particular one here. You can see that I've got like 30%, which is like misconfigured or exposed, that I need to address. And you can see, the affected items and the weight of those items, etc. Now, if I click into the security recommendations for this metric, you'll see the specific things that are making up the metric that we're defining, the things that need to be put into a compliant state effectively. So we have a number of things here which are compliant. So I mentioned already about ADCS. You can see here we've got ESC4 misconfigurations that might need to be addressed, which is a particular ADCS vulnerability. We have ESC2. We can see about making sure Microsoft Defender for Identity is installed on all of the domain controllers. And then we've got two here which are non-compliant. So these are the two that I need to fix. So this is just an example of some of the controls that might be surfaced up. Now this is an interesting one here, which is prevent users from requesting certificates with arbitrary subject alternative names. So if you're not familiar with this, if you deploy ADCS and you create a certificate template, then there might be an instance where that certificate template allows arbitrary names to be passed into the certificate request. That can lead to privilege escalation, because if I can go to the certificate authority and say, hey, my name's, if Chris is a domain admin, my name's Chris, or probably more specifically, my name's Heike, actually, to make it more real. Heike is a domain admin. I can impersonate Heike. Heike's, somebody that's got privilege within the environment. I can request a certificate under her name, and then I can use that certificate to escalate my privilege, to log in as Heike, and to do nefarious things under the context of her. So we can identify that misconfiguration here. We can give you visibility of it. We can give you some steps in terms of how to remediate it. There's some documentation there as well. And then we can see the actual entity that's exposed. So in this instance, there's one certificate template here, which is the Ayres user template. And you can see that that's the one that's got the misconfiguration, the one that needs to be addressed. And we can see how it relates to the initiative. Of course, it's in the identity security initiative. And you can see, for some reason, that's flicking back. I don't know why that's happening. And then we can go to the related metrics as well in terms of where it aligns to. So that's just one example of one of the metrics. There's another one here, which is an unsecured domain configuration. Again, if I look at the exposed entities, I can see here that in the Ayres domain, I've got two things that need to be addressed in terms of misconfigurations. One is enforcing LDAP signing, and one is setting the MSDS machine account quota to 0 to prevent some of the resource-based constrained delegation attacks that are out there today. We have a number of different recommendations which make up the metrics. I can look at the source of the recommendations here as well. So if I go into all 39, I can actually just get a list of all of them. I can filter this list if I want to and just see the non-compliant ones. But you'll see that there are things in here that relate to both the identity infrastructure and identities themselves. So as an example, there's this Kerberos delegation one here. Again, if I look at the exposed entities, I will see that there's a machine here that has unconstrained delegation that could be leveraged by an attacker to gain access, elevated access under the context of that particular under the context of a privileged user from that machine account, if that machine account was to be compromised. So we are identifying those different misconfigurations that are there. So that's one part of the exposure management. The other part I'm going to talk about in a second. I just want to flick over to a different page now and actually show you some of the privilege escalation paths that we can identify as well. So we've got this user here, which is the Nesta user. I'm going to talk a little bit about the user page in more depth when we get to the investigation session, because we're going to actually go into here and like talk about what all these things mean. But what you'll see here is we have these entity details listed here, and then we can see this observed in organization, and we've got visibility of things like the groups, the locations the users logged in from, lateral movement paths there, the devices the users logged in from. I can click those hyperlinks, or I can go into this tab here on the user page, which is observed in organization. And then if I click on the lateral movements here, what it should do is give me a visibility of a lateral movement path that could be exploited for this particular user. So then the user is Nesta. Again, I can see context about the user. This user is an administrator, a domain admin. I've got some sensitive privileges for this user as well. And these are the reasons why the user is, is deemed to be sensitive. Now, in this instance, what we're telling you here is that Jonathan Walcott, who is a low privileged user in this instance, and again, I could go to the user page of Jonathan and see the context of him. He is logged into this machine here, which is this Windows 10V machine. And on this machine, we've got Deborah also logged into the machine. So her credentials are in memory on this machine here. Now, Deborah is actually a member of the help desk group. The help desk group has permissions on this Windows 10B device, and Nesta is logged onto there. So what we're saying is, if Jonathan is compromised and an attacker manages to get access to dump credentials from memory, they could dump Deborah's credentials and then use Deborah's credentials to move laterally onto Windows 10B, and then actually get access to Nesta's account and do some nefarious things with Nesta, because Nesta is a domain admin. So we need to protect those tier 0 users, those tier 0 assets. This is probably an attack path that I want to remediate. And the way I would probably remediate that is by ensuring that the help desk group that Deborah is a member of doesn't have local administrator permissions on tier 0 assets, which this would be if a domain admin is logging into that machine. So I would create a separate OU, move the machines into there. We're talking about privileged access devices and things like that at that point. So it's really interesting for us to identify that. Now, all of the lateral movement paths, we do actually surface a security recommendation on this, which is in the exposure management that I was just talking about. And we also surface it in hunting as well. So you can go into hunting, you can write a query that says, show me all the lateral movement paths that have been identified in this environment. Now, if I click on this 3 dots here, I can actually go to view in map. And this is where it takes me to the attack surface map within the exposure management side that I was just talking about a second ago. And I can start to build out interesting context about Nesta then. So I can see here that Nesta is a critical account because he's got this little crown there. And I can see lots of interesting information about Nesta. This is all of the data that, like, the different XDR tools, particularly MDI, has surfaced up for exposure management to build context about the account. I can see here that Nesta can authenticate to this device here, which is the Windows 10B device that I was just talking about. I can also see that Nesta is a member of domain admins, and I can see that Nesta is also a member of these 2 groups here, which might be interesting for me as well. Now, if I click on that Windows 10B device, I can actually expand that, and I can see that there's 2 groups there that have ability to log on to this machine as well, which is what I was just showing you in the lateral movement path. And then we can see those by extracting those groups. And again, I can start to pivot and see, well, who's a member of the help desk group. And if I expand the help desk group, I can see I've got 2 user accounts there in Lynn and Deborah. So ultimately, if I can get access to Lynn or Deborah's account, I can use those accounts via my help desk privilege to log on to that Windows 10B device. And ultimately, Nesta is the user that's logged on there. So there's so much information in this exposure management. I've only just scratched the surface, like really scratched the surface of it. There's tons of information. There's tons you can do with it. The data's populated from all of the XDR tools. So I'd encourage you to to check it out, see what information it's surfacing in your environment. If there are specific attack paths, then they will also be surfaced in the attack paths there as well. So you can click on that, and then if there's anything that needs to be addressed from a privilege escalation point of view, that will be listed there. There's just one last quick thing that I want to show you. I can't remember, not in this one. Let me just flip back over in here, which is the adaptive access control, just to sort of round out the prevention side of things. So you should all hopefully be familiar with conditional access, because it's a solution that's been around for many, many years. It's really, really powerful. Of course, where you would configure it is in protection here, and then you've got conditional access that you can click on there. And then when you click on conditional access, you have a set of policies that you can look at. You can create policies from templates. I can click new policy from template here, and there's some specific templates that might be interesting for you to enable. So as an example, there might be block legacy authentication, or there could be like blocking emerging threats to enable phish-resistant MFA, or in the zero trust side, we've got require MFA for all users, require MFA for admins, require MFA for guest access, and so on. So there's a ton of templates here that you can just click on, and then you can review and create them directly. And there are policies that you can enable based on user risk. So user risk we can influence from the XDR portal, and of course Entra is building its own user risk there as well. And then what we could do is we could have a conditional access policy that is going to trigger, I'll just discard that, it is going to trigger based on that risk signal. So I would come into the conditions here. You can see I've got user risk here, and then I can enable like high risk, medium risk, and low risk. I can assign particular target resources as well. So I can look at applying to cloud applications, and now we can support those on-premises applications through the Entra private access as well. So that would be in my, I haven't got any in this tenant here, but that would be in my application list there. They would just be surfaced up as an application that I can assign there. So you can think of an example of RDP to domain controllers is, you know, a pretty solid example there. So I can create a conditional access policy that says, you know, anyone that's logging on to domain controllers via RDP, they should have MFA applied via conditional access. We could even do things like phish resistant MFA, you know, if that was important, or if the user's at risk, we could block access as an example. So that's how we're starting to build out those that policy engine to enable us to apply specific adaptive authentication to those workflows that might be relevant. So with that, I think I've covered all of, well, scratched the surface at least on all of the prevention capabilities, a little bit on adaptive access. I know we're running a little bit up to the hour, Heike, but I don't know if there's any final questions in the last couple of minutes that we can tackle.
Yes. Yes, so there was a question around licensing. So it means if you need any additional license to have ITDR.
So ITDR, think of ITDR as a platform and a set of capabilities. What I would say is to get the full gamut of capabilities, Microsoft Defender for Identity is a pretty important component of that. Microsoft Defender for Identity is licensed in its own way, and that would get you capabilities for domain controllers, for certificate servers, for ADFS and all those other things that I mentioned. Then Entra has a set of capabilities. Some of those are in Entra P1, some of those are in Entra P2. Depends which license you've got, will depend on what gets lit up with that. As an example, the risk-based conditional access is a P2 license, but you can use conditional access in P1. So, you know, there's a broad set of capabilities that you could leverage, and then only, you know, those additional capabilities in P2. Things like the secure score being replicated between the two portals, that's you know, if you've got MDI deployed and you've got Entra P1, then that would be surfaced there as well. So it's more of a platform concept by ITDR, and then licensing particularly would be MDI, and then whatever license of Entra or whatever flavor of Entra that you're using.
Thank you very much. So, and with that, because we are on the hour, so Chris, thank you so much for being our guest and for sharing the great information with our community. Of course, also thank you to the Q&A team who helped us with answering the questions and providing the resourceful information. And then to all the listeners still on the line, if you are someone who wishes to aid in the protection of the world from cyber threats and desire to have a say in shaping our strategies, blueprints, and recommendations, then we invite you to become part of our security community. Together, we can make a global impact. So join us at aka.ms/security community. This is also where you will be notified about the upcoming webinars, events, and other announcements. Also, please take a minute submitting your webinar feedback at aka.ms/security webinar feedback. For those of you who may have additional questions on this topic we just covered or other product-related questions, please feel free to raise them at our Microsoft Tech Community discussion spaces. You can find them at aka.ms/ I think it's still M365DTC, the old name, and from there you can find Defender for Identity, Defender for Office 365, or any other products. Thank you all for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.